Good day, everybody, and welcome to our podcast series, Building a Greener Future. My name's Steve McIntyre, Principal Urban Environmental Consultant at A&S Global, and I'm joined today from Tom Butterworth from WSP. I've been involved with green infrastructure for over 20 years, and we've seen the changing climate, and we're in the middle of some crises at the moment. And Tom and myself are going to have a brief discussion now about the future, and I'm just going to hand over to Tom Butterworth from WSP to introduce himself. So thank you all for joining today.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for the opportunity to come and chat with you on your podcast. So my name's Tom Butterworth. To introduce myself a little bit, I work for WSP. Now, WSP is a large consultancy, engineering consultancy, but about a quarter of our staff, probably increasing now, are environmental specialists. And I sit in the UK part of our business. It's a Canadian-owned business, but I sit in the UK piece, looking after our ecology team. We have about 200 ecologists in there. And that includes ecology. We treat as quite a broad church. That includes natural capital specialists, aquatic ecologists, urban ecologists, and so on. So from green infrastructure through to biodiversity net gain, through to natural capital, through to all of the normal things that you might think of an ecologist doing, going out on site and looking for dormice and bats and so on. So I oversee that team, which is fantastic, and I've been involved in green infrastructure for a little while now as well. I used to work for Natural England and there oversaw some of the green infrastructure work for a while, and oversaw some of the biodiversity strategies as well, both across England and then in specific parts of England like the southeast. So yeah, that's my background. Prior to that, I worked in charities, conservation charities, and in academia, but primarily it's been in government and industry.
Thank you, Tom. That's very interesting. You've got a wealth of experience there, which I think we can draw on for the next few minutes today to actually help us go forward, because what we're focusing on is, as I've said, building a greener future. And if we just cast our minds back 20 years ago, we actually had soft landscaping, we had ecology, we had soil in our cities, in our towns, and in our urban spaces. And probably we've taken soil for granted in our cities and towns. But what's come to light over the last 20 years, we've replaced that soil for concrete. And now we have some challenges, some big environmental changes. So we've got to change what we've done to a greener future, which means we've got to speak to the developers, to consultants, to planners, to actually realize the importance of this change. So we're in a changing environment for developers. And I think, Tom, you've been involved with a lot of this changing environment. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how the changing environment is affecting what you do today to on the journey you've come from.
So really interesting story that we're going through at the moment, and I think I think you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head, Steve, in terms of real challenges at the moment. We're coming to the point where the impact on the environment that we're having, whether it be climate change or soil loss or the heating of our urban areas or loss of biodiversity and the impact that has on the pollination and so on, that's starting to hit businesses. It's starting to hit the bottom line. And because of that, businesses are starting to recognize that if they don't act on this stuff, they're not going to be able to carry on functioning in the way that they have been to date. As you, I'm sure, know, we've lost vast majority of our biodiversity in England and the UK since 1970. The most recent stats actually haven't been produced. JNCC are not producing stats this year, but the last set of stats said something like 40 to 60%, depending on which group of species you look at, have decreased in abundance. Sorry, let me rephrase that: a decrease of abundance by 40 or 60% since 1970. And it's not like 1970 was some golden era where biodiversity was looking fantastic. That was post-industrial revolution and so on. So you're absolutely right. We're on a massive challenge here, that we've lost biodiversity. and all the things that biodiversity then provides for us. And just as we're losing all of that, we're realizing how important it is, how important biodiversity is to our health and well-being, how important it is to get out in green space and be able to access that, through the last few years with COVID. That's been really evident. And then how that plays out for how we live and work in our towns and cities. So yeah, I think my view is that we are at a crunch point or a tipping point where not only is the environment right at the edge of what it's able to do in terms of resilience, but also society, businesses, individuals are starting to recognize that we're not separate from the environment, that we're part of it, and our health and well-being is tied up with the environment we live within.
That's very, very, very important to actually realize that biodiversity is not just one segment of life, you might say. Biodiversity embraces so many different angles of our daily life, our daily walk, and it's really what we've taken away. So now we've got to start looking at ways we can give it back, give back what we've taken away. We often talk about it, but we've now got to look at action. And I think probably, as you say, we're starting to realize it's hitting the bottom line, and we're realizing what we've lost in the terms of pollination, nectar, way of well-being standards. And on the back of that, we're seeing increase in housing, increase in development. And we've got this new agenda for more houses, which we understand. We're in an island where we've got limited land. So what advice would you give to developers to actually realize that we're in a changing environment and we've got to start looking at the potential to give back our biodiverse landscape?
I think there's a real opportunity here. So any time of crisis is also a place of opportunity, isn't it? I think we need to recognize that our rural environment isn't some biodiverse haven. Most of our rural environment is very intensively farmed. And that's really important in some respects, in some places for food production. But we need to think very carefully about that, because we need to produce that food in a way that's also maintaining our water, looking after our water quality, not losing the soils. But we shouldn't be thinking by building more houses, we're losing pristine, beautiful nature. Generally speaking, most parts of the UK, that's not the case. When we build more houses, it's on land that is not the highest quality for wildlife. So there's a huge opportunity there to transform that land and deliver benefits for biodiversity through development. I worked quite a few years ago on identifying and working with conservation target areas in Oxfordshire. So these are large areas that were identified to focus conservation effort. They were then spread out to the southeast as biodiversity opportunity areas. And we're seeing similar things now through the Environment Act with the nature recovery strategies that are being developed. And I think there's an evolution there. Certainly in Oxfordshire, they've evolved into this nature recovery strategy. Now, the reason I bring up these large areas of targeted conservation effort is that one of those areas in Oxfordshire was full of minerals work. And the reason it was a conservation target area was because of that minerals work. Because off the back of drawing minerals out of the ground, we were creating, the minerals companies with the conservation organizations, with the local community, were creating these fantastic wildlife havens. They won lots of awards, and they're creating some really special habitats in this river valley. And so it's absolutely possible for development to create fantastic, beautiful places that are vibrant for people to live in, that are great places to people to live in, and rich with biodiversity. And increasingly we're seeing that. And the requirement for biodiversity net gain, the green infrastructure standards that are coming through from the government, all of that will enhance this and create greater opportunities for delivering these great places. Now, one of the challenges to this is that can mean needing greater areas of land, because if you're going to have housing and the green space and include in that green space the flood relief, the improvement of air quality, the places that are going to keep the city cool, the trees and green space that are going to keep the city cool under climate change scenarios, then it does mean more space than packing in the houses as tightly as possible. But I think that's crucial to recognize and embrace, actually, if we're going to create really resilient, robust places.
I think that's really, really important what you raised there, because as you rightly point out, that the land might say grade B land, it might not be maximized for its ecology prior to developing, but when we're starting to develop a site, it's then the opportunity to actually look at, you might say, the undeveloped potential of that area, and to see what we're lacking, what can be included. As you say, we look at sustainable drainage. With every challenge, as you rightly said, there's an opportunity. So even with the drainage systems and the water and storing rainwater, we're looking at pools and water attenuation. All these have opportunities to enhance our biodiversity. And I think we've just come through one of the hottest summers, driest summers since 1976 or prior. I haven't got the final statistics yet. So that also links to having a changing climate. So we need to think, okay, water attenuation, but that water can be utilized into biodiversity, as you said. Can you say a little bit more about how you can link aqua biodiversity along with ecology?
Absolutely. And I think that's really crucial in this hot summer. I think in terms of hot days, 1976 is something like 13th on the list, isn't it? And most of the top 10 are in the last how many ever years, and certainly this year has seen top 10 days as well. So yeah, we are in a changing environment, and I think we need to recognize that, and we need to build, the developments that we create, the housing, the road, the rail, the energy infrastructure. It's going to be there for a long time. If we do it right, it's going to be there for a very long time. A lot of the infrastructure we're using is based on Victorian infrastructure. Some of it even older than that. We're still walking along Roman roads in some parts of the UK, obviously resurfaced, but nevertheless, the infrastructure is going to be there for a long time. And at the very least, we're talking 50 years, probably more than that, which means that we need to design it with the future in mind. Yeah, so we within WSP, we call this being future ready, and we look at a whole range of trends going forward and think, well, how can we design to take account of the change in urban density and perhaps increased loneliness as a result of improved technology? And how can we take account of the decreased water in our systems, in our rivers? How can we address our biodiversity loss and look at how we can get integrated solutions? Now, water is an absolute fundamental part of our ecosystems, and it's, of course, right at the top of our minds at the moment, with lots of people having hosepipe bans and thinking carefully about shower lengths and things like that. Putting in the infrastructure for the reservoirs is going to be crucial. That's absolutely certain. But we also need to, alongside that, we also need to make our places more friendly to water use, so that when the water going down the drain, for example, is a better quality. One of the issues we have in these drought situations is a lot of the water going down our rivers has gone through the sewage works. Now, that's not necessarily a horrific thing, because a lot of that is, our shower water. It's not all, through our toilets. And so there's an important message there that, we might say it's through the sewage works, but it's still water and still good quality. But nevertheless, that's a lot of the water that's in our rivers. The other bit of water will be, when the time comes to get some rain, will be runoff through our cities. Now, we need that to be good quality as well. And one of the issues we miss is that the water running off our roads, the water running off our buildings, isn't always great quality. Now, if we can get that to run through natural systems, grasslands, reed beds, sustainable urban drainage, we can start to clean that water before it's even got into the river. And that can be incredibly valuable for the biodiversity in that river system, but it also creates a great place for biodiversity within that urban area. And we're starting to see this with people like United Utilities putting sustainable urban drainage across Manchester to decrease the negative impacts on water quality. And then the other side to this, and the other side of climate change, is that our winters are going to be wetter and warmer. And that has almost the reverse impact that we've seen this summer. So we need to make our places resilient to that high levels of rainfall that we're going to see in the winter. And again, the same systems, the same natural systems will be able to provide us greater resilience there. We've got some massive challenges there, which one of them is a measurement challenge. Well, how good is a reed bed in cleaning your water compared to a filter? How good is a sustainable urban drainage at capturing flood water compared to a box under the ground made of concrete? We do need to get past that, but that and build beyond that and think beyond that. But we can. Now is the time to do that. And these systems are not only more resilient, but they're more. We're able to change them more. So what I mean by that is, if you're putting in a sustainable urban drainage area that's going to capture water, if it's not capturing enough, it's really easy to change its design, shift the plants in it, dig it out, rebuild it. Really, really simple. It's actually, something that most of us could do with a spade. If you've got a concrete tank under the ground, my goodness, that's a big engineering task to deal with that one. So we need to think about these systems not just in terms of what are they doing for us, and are they going to provide the same quality output as our traditional solutions, but also, are they adaptable to change that we're going to see over time? And I think the natural systems, play aces in all of that.
I think that's really, really enthusing, because that's really, it's starting to get everyone to take an interest in the green space, because if we can see that we can utilize that water, create these spaces. We mentioned at the beginning, well-being standards and biophilic connection with nature. We can actually create these areas that will be pleasurable to visit. We've got water being drained through the reeds. We can create them, as you might say, natural features, natural oases that are working for the environment, at the same time improving our landscape.
There's one recent study showing that access to green space, we've got tons of studies showing that improves health and well-being. There's one recent study showing that if it's got blue spaces in it too, water, your well-being increases further. Yes, so that you get an even better benefit. It's one study so far, but it's interesting, isn't it? But,
it is, absolutely. And that is really the opportunities that you and I can see at the moment in the industry, that we can actually start looking at these sites. And rather than just, as you say, put concrete tanks under the ground and try and compress everything to a narrow space, let's utilize more land, utilize nature, and give a natural filter, clean the water, bringing it back into the green environment. At the same time, we're going to get evaporation and transpiration. We're putting that water back into the atmosphere. How much it will help with cooling the environment if we've got these reed beds working. So we're actually starting to see a picture come together to say that the power of nature is always there, but we've got to use it. We've got to include it into the schemes and have that vision. And I think that's something that developers need to see. You mentioned the bottom line, but this has a real sustainable value to how our oncoming generation are going to live. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we need to be engineering with nature. Not thinking of it as an add-on, not think of it as an extra, but actually it's core part of our engineering. One of the materials we're using is nature. So yes, we think about, what's the tensile strength of that piece of concrete or whatever it might be to put in there. But we're also thinking about, okay, well, how does nature play a part of the design process and the materials we're using to create place? In the Himalayas, they build bridges out of fig trees. I'm not saying we go that far, but if we could design a bridge that was doing half the things that fig tree is doing, because it's absorbing carbon, stabilizing the bank, cooling the environment, as well as providing a bridge across the river. Oh, and it's self-mending, of course. So, got this fantastic thing. How many pieces of infrastructure could we say are doing all of that? Nature has a possibility to do that for us. We just need to start designing with it.
Exactly. And that is, I think, is something we need to have our eyes open to see what nature can do for us, because we have got so many opportunities. And we've got legislation that's in our favor. We've got the BNG, and it's going to be mandatory. And as we often say, I think we should look at the BNG, the biodiversity net gain, leaving a site in an increased 10% net gain improvement or more. Let's not just aim for the minimum. Let's look at the BNG and say, what can we do to improve? Where can we go? One sense, put budget to the side for a minute, because how much does the future really value? What value can you put on ecology? What value can you put on better space? So we've really got to help architects, designers, consultants, land use consultants. I think let's look at the site at the beginning and say, where are we going to go with this? Because if we start reinforcing green space now, 20 years on from where we are, we could be in a completely different space. Do you think?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying, Steve. I think that we often want to start, or I think a good place to start is to ask, well, what are the issues on this site? What are the things that are going to create challenges for that development? And how can nature help us overcome those challenges? How can nature deliver the things we need, whether it be managing floodwaters or improving air quality? That is a really nice place to start. And BNG, biodiversity net gain, as a legal requirement, will then be one of the challenges, of course, but it's not the only one. And biodiversity net gain can and should be delivered hand in hand with the other requirements. There might be requirements on accessible green space. There might be requirements like in London for the green space, urban greening factor, to make sure that there's a certain amount of green in our very urban areas. There might be other requirements like decreasing flood risk. Which bits can nature help address? And then alongside that, I think it's really crucial we look at the social impacts of what we're doing, because there is a real challenge here that some of these pieces we've been talking about impact on the ability for that development to get planning application approval, the bottom line for the business. A lot of these things impact on the people that are living in that space over the long term, whether that be the air quality improvements or the accessible green space. That's actually going to hit the people living there much more than it will the developer, if the developer comes in and walks away, comes in, builds the houses and then walks away. And I think it's really, really important that we recognize the social importance of green space. But green space isn't a luxury. It mustn't be a luxury. We mustn't use biodiversity net gain to impact in a poor area in a city only to compensate, to put the offset, the biodiversity gain, into a richer area. Those richer areas may be more spacious. They may have more green space we can enhance already, but we mustn't deprive the poor areas in our towns and cities just because there's this process now where you can look elsewhere. So we need to be looking both at the impacts on the business, but also impact on that local community as well. And there's huge opportunities for enhancement locally. There's fantastic work done by people like John Little in Clapton Park Estate in London, where they've greened up and worked with the local residents to create some allotments and different green spaces, changing the way that the whole estate looks, changing the way that the whole estate works, and working with the community to create that. That's now, an exemplar and being copied by others around London and elsewhere as a way to create green spaces in what is actually quite a really dense urban area. So yeah, balancing that both social and that need for the developer is really crucial.
I think you've really hit it on the head there in actually looking at the site at the beginning and saying what is the need, because it's not the same need on every site. It's not the same. It's not a blueprint we're talking about here. It's actually developing ecology. You might look at a street in a very busy area in central city, or in the cities and built up environment, but you might also have a rural environment that's going to be developed. And we've got two different criterias, but we must look at that need and we must reflect that need, as you say, socially and ecologically, environmentally. You know, we've got different rainfall levels, we've got different runoffs, we've got different soil structures. There's so much to consider. But how can you help developers to actually make this consideration at early stages? Do you come up with resistance at times?
Yeah, of course. What I would like to see is a change in the way that we develop places, whether that be for large infrastructure or for housing development or whatever it might be, to work with nature as a starting point. You know, landscape led. My landscape colleagues talk about, and I absolutely believe that. Looking at the landscape, and that landscape isn't just an ecological landscape; it's a social landscape as well. It's an economic landscape, and can we allow that landscape to lead the development rather than think, oh, we've got to get this number of houses in. And I think this is a real challenge of sort of targets for housing numbers or targets for certain development types. We need to allow the landscape in the place to create and design that design come from that landscape, and the risk of, well, we've got to get X number of houses in is that you go the other way around. So yes, of course we get pushback and challenge. I think there's a number of things that are really helpful. One is that very often the green space needs to be delivered anyway, so there might be an accessible green space requirement, and so the question isn't whether you put in green space or not, it's how you can help the developer deal with the other issues that are in play using that green space that they've got to put in. And this is where biodiversity net gain is going to be incredibly valuable, as long as we keep it local and on site, if we can, you know, wherever we can. Then that requirement for delivering a gain in biodiversity, or the urban greening factor in very urban areas, we'll see leads to, hopefully, a greater greening of those developments, because it will become cheaper and more efficient to green that local area that you're working in, you're developing in. And if done well, it will deliver these wider benefits that they have to deliver anyway for their planning application. Then, of course, we've also got, and this is a really crucial piece, we've also got this requirement for these sites to be looked after over 30 years. Now, we're yet to see how DEFRA play out on their responses to the consultation that they've put out, how they address all of the issues they've raised. But if we've got a 30-year requirement both on-site and off-site, so on that development parcel, that means the developer has to put in place somebody who's going to manage that over the long term. A management company, perhaps. It may not be the developer themselves, but a management company. Now, at the moment, management companies tend to look after the bits of greenery we put in and cut the grass. Yes, and by bits of greenery, it's often sort of a bed of pansies or whatever it might be that they're putting in, and that's fine. You know, I've nothing against that, but I'm just saying that there's a huge opportunity here to expand on that, to do for those management companies to pick up a whole load of different interesting work, creating areas that are doing all of the things we've talked about, improving biodiversity, decreasing flood risk, creating fantastic places for people to be in. And that is a whole different way of managing a place. Yeah, it means managing the grasslands in a different way, cutting it using different kit actually to cut it at different times of year, making sure that we've got accessible places for people to move through that are not stomping all over the orchids that have been put in, perhaps, you know, while the orchids are coming up, opening it up for football later in the year or whatever it might be, once all of those flowers have bloomed and set seed. There's a whole load of opportunities there that change the way we manage places that I think could be a much more interesting job than just going up and mowing the field every few weeks. So that 30-year requirement is going to open up an opportunity here to deliver much more than just biodiversity, to deliver all of these green infrastructure requirements or opportunities off the back of that.
That is really, really interesting, because, as you say, you've got the 30-year management plan, you've got the green infrastructure being included at the beginning, and I think that's that's key. Is it's not a question of a box ticking exercise. I've located all the houses I want to put in. Now, where can I squeeze in green infrastructure? I think we need to turn it on its head and say, right, this is the site. Let's be landscape led, environmentally led. Look at the ecology. Look at where we want the trees, where we want the actual water attenuation, where we're going to do these grasslands, and then plot the buildings around it. And if we start to rebuild that way, we will actually get an increase in value as well. I think the developers will get an increase in value, because instead of looking at, you might say, Legoland or something like that in boxes altogether, we're actually creating now an enhanced site. We've still got the indwellings, but we've structured it properly. And I think that is where it would help to educate the industry to see that this is a potential value, not just for the environment, though that's what we're primarily concerned about, but it's not a loss for them, it's a gain. Do you think?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember looking at a site, this was a long time ago, and I won't mention the specific site, but looking at a site where it was an old quarry that they were trying to build in, and they didn't want to have a negative impact on the ecology on the quarry slopes sides, so they decided to build right in the middle of the quarry and build some quite intensive housing. I think that was a huge opportunity missed, because they could have absolutely shifted that to build in a different way, to build perhaps along in the quarry faces and so on, and slope, that would have been much nicer places to live within, rather than this very dense sort of block of houses in the middle of a quarry, or ex-quarry, and much nicer places to live in. And they could have been done enhancing the biodiversity. You know, you could absolutely have had houses that are providing roosting sites for bats, birds, and so on, as part of actually an extension of what that quarry is providing ecologically. You know, after all, it's a man-made structure to start with, as is most of our landscape. So, yeah, huge opportunities there. It is a very significant mind shift in attitude that we need to see, and that's going to take some time. You know, these are quite possibly generational shifts, but we need to do it as fast as possible.
Absolutely.
I'm convinced as well, when we look back at this time, we'll look at this and go, my goodness, didn't we change quickly? But living through it, you think, oh, another 3 years to get the green infrastructure standards out. Oh, really? Can we wait that long? You know, but yeah, in the long term, we're moving so quickly at the moment.
Yeah, and we've got to keep that pace up. Do you have much contact with local authorities? Do you think they realise the speed that we need to work at?
Yes, we work a lot with local authorities. We're doing an awful lot of work at the moment, working to help them get ready for the biodiversity net gain requirement.
Brilliant.
Yeah, which is a really important step forward. We've also done a lot with local authorities looking at green infrastructure need as well as opportunity. So not just mapping where the green infrastructure is, not just where it could be, but where is the need for green infrastructure in terms of, let's look at the index of multiple deprivation and see issues that are identified within that green infrastructure can actually help us deliver against. Obesity or levels of mental illness and so on, that we know green space can help with. And so we can target green space. I should say also issues like flood risk or areas of high levels of heating in summer situations and so on, areas where there's high levels of air pollution. So we can target green infrastructure into those areas. So yeah, we've been doing some really interesting work like that with local authorities as well. But your question was, do they understand the rate of change that needs to be put in place? Well, I think lots of them do, or lots of the individuals within local authorities do. I think they are really strapped for cash at the moment. I think we've lost most of the ecological expertise, and with that went the green infrastructure expertise within the local authorities. When I was working in government, we used to fund green infrastructure strategy development and a local biodiversity action plan coordinator in every county. and that's disappeared. That's quite a few years ago now, but that's disappeared. And I think that local authorities are struggling to get the staff in place to be able to go beyond just dealing with the churn of planning applications and get into that strategic thinking about, well, where do we go next and how do we do it? And I think it's a massive challenge. There's an awful lot pushed onto local authorities' plates.
That's really helpful, because obviously I'm not mentioning any names, but as something that I've come across only recently is that the actual personnel have got the vision for it, and they can see what they want to do within their borough, but they're lacking the resource to deliver it.
Yeah.
And this is what I think we need to take to, maybe take it offline, but we want to try and get this messaging out to those that can influence, those that can make a difference, which must come from central government and then come down to landowners, to developers, so that everybody's on the same page to actually realize that the positives of nature and bringing these schemes in is not a nice to have. It's not if we've got the budget. It's nothing worse than seeing all the work go in from the likes of WSP or somebody else, and the scheme's drawn up, and then it goes to value engineer or design and build, and everything gets repositioned and the fundamental principles get left behind. Yeah. And unfortunately, the local planners don't have the resource or the expertise to actually manage that situation, to make sure it's delivered in accordance with your vision at the beginning. Do you think?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And again, biodiversity net gain is not going to be the panacea for all of this, but it does provide one opportunity for getting some income through to local authorities in terms of money to help oversee and manage some of these green spaces into the long term. I know local authorities have been trying to get rid of all of their green space and pass it on to others to manage. I think the tide is turning there, and there's a recognition that actually this green space is a real asset. And if we think about it in terms of just carbon and biodiversity and what it could provide against carbon targets and biodiversity net gain targets, it's an asset that they can almost, mine as such. They can draw out, and so there are income sources here, or perhaps providing specific advice for developers, planning advice for developers that can be paid for. These are being picked up by local authorities, so it's one of the solutions. I think one of the challenges we have is that very often local authorities look at those that, one local authority will look at another that's doing it and got it up and running, but they can't see how to leapfrog into that position when they're stuck without that additional resource that's needed. And so we need some sort of Kickstarter funding, really, to get local authorities up and running on all of this, so that they can then start moving. And we have had some through, I think, promised from the Environment Act or linked to the Environment Act, but again, it was really peanuts compared to what's needed. So yeah, there's a real challenge there, and absolutely happy to pick that up offline as well. I think there's great organisations like ALGI, that's the Association for Local Government Ecologists, and then other organisations heading up Green Infrastructure Partnership and so on that are doing brilliant work. But how we get the local authorities to be able to leapfrog into that position of actually making this work for them as well is a really big challenge, I think. Yeah,
it is a big challenge, but it's also a very enthusing vision for the future. And actually, I think we've got the challenge for the local authorities, but actually there is a vehicle that we could build to actually deliver this by bringing everyone onto the same page. Yeah. And I think that's the important sort of having educational sessions where we can get a message out to say, when we're looking at a site, as you said earlier, let's stand back and say, what is the need? What are we going to get in the way of carbon sequestration? What are we going to achieve in the way of air purification? What are we going to what can we establish using the power of nature? And now let's build our infrastructure around that place. We've got green infrastructure, then we've got the main site infrastructure, we've got water attenuation, we've got water filtration. We're now making the space work, and it's not just hard, as we said at the beginning, not just hard concrete, but actually now we've got the same accommodation, but we've got green space, and we've got a better future.
Absolutely, and one way that local authorities are stepping up to this, which I think is fantastic to see, is they're choosing one site to do this on as a starting point, working with a developer that they've worked with lots, that's willing to take this step up. You know, there's lots of developers that are committing to biodiversity net gain prior to it being a legal requirement. And working with them will allow the local authority to build the skills, the understanding, the experience, and to show the rest of the local authority what's possible, show how the development can shift and change when you take this landscape-led approach from the outset. And that's a really great way in, trying not to eat the elephant, but take one bite and work through it that way. Especially when you're working, with others in partnership, whether it be that developer I've mentioned, but also potentially local wildlife trusts or other groups, local community groups. There's huge opportunity there. And then you start to open up the door of, well, let's have a look at what money is going out the local authority in terms of, I don't know, pesticide licensing and for keeping the streets clean and mowing, which is often two different licenses. Could you bring those together and deal with them differently? Could the same money do something different? What about the management, the ongoing management cost for the site? Where does that sit? Are you just going to pass it to a management company, or the local authority going to oversee that and take responsibility to make sure it's delivered, but also then get some real added value from doing so? So there's the opportunities are there, and what we need to do is really create the space for the local authorities to pick up and run with that, and work with the interested developers to demonstrate what's possible. As I say, I think we're at a tipping point where these will be one or two here and there now, but in a few years' time, this will be standard, and we'll accept it as normal.
That's really, really good, and I love the terms you use as landscape-led and then future-proofed. So we're actually building a better space going forward, and what we can do is help each of us to look at our schemes. Maybe we take a step back and we don't do quite so much in the way of annuals and having to replace plants every year, but we look at including more wildflowers, more structures, more structural planting, maybe just less, as you just mentioned, mowing, grassland, and put a mower over it. It's probably the cheapest option at the time, but let's look at the bigger picture: wildflower meadows, creating the butterflies, creating this pollination. The space is good, just using the space in a different way. Absolutely. And we've done some really interesting work with local authorities looking at their climate commitments. So a lot of local authorities have said that they're committing to addressing the climate challenge, and we looked at how we could do that, how local authorities and specific local authorities could become net zero in their working. And there's lots of things that can be done: changing the fleet of cars to electric cars, insulating the offices, all really crucial things. Interestingly, planting trees on the land where the trees could be planted did have a positive impact, but it was relatively moderate. It had a positive impact, but it wasn't as much as, say, changing their offices and leisure facilities to being to zero carbon electricity. However, a crucial piece, that tree planting anyway, but the biggest piece of all of that was actually how they managed the land. Now, this local authority had a bit of land, farmed land, and land that was used as playing fields and so on. And managing that land at the moment, as it was under agricultural use, it was releasing carbon. And changing the way that land was managed was by far the biggest impact on their climate target. So in other words, we cannot deliver net zero carbon
without taking green space very, very seriously. Not just about tree planting, yeah, that's important, but also in terms of how we manage all of that green space. Yeah, with all of those local authorities, all of those organizations that have committed to net zero carbon by 2030, 2050, whatever it might be, it's simply going to be impossible without doing all of the stuff we've been talking about. And that synergy, yes, could be seen like a massive challenge. It's a huge opportunity. With lots of talk about regenerative farming, lots of talk about making sure that we've got the trees in our urban spaces to cool our urban spaces. All of that is going to be shifting the way we use land to lock up carbon, to draw down carbon and have a less impact on our climate. So yeah,
that
synergies
is very, very
everywhere
helpful.
we go.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful, Tom. I think that's a important thing to consider. We've got to relook at the land and how we use it if we are going to go to carbon zero by 2030. We've got to make these changes, and the time to change is now. Now is the time to start taking these points forward. That's been a very helpful. I've enjoyed your company today.
It's been really nice to have a chat, Steve. Really good. Yeah. Lovely.
Well, thank you very much for joining. Anything else you want to add in closing, Tom?
Yes, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I think what the story we've talked about is really, really crucial. There's a parallel story to this that I just wanted to flag. We've got a biodiversity COP. So like we have the climate COP in Glasgow last year, we've got a biodiversity COP coming up in Montreal in December. And it looks like it's going to set targets for businesses to report on their impact on nature for the first time ever. This is the
Brilliant.
first time we're getting an international agreement on biodiversity that says anything about businesses. And it looks like it's going to say that we all have to, certainly the big businesses, have to report on their impacts on nature and address those. Now that is yet another driver. And so all of these things we've done, whether it's local authorities or the developers, all of this work can help us deliver against these targets. So it's coming down the track to see nature in exactly the same way that we're starting to see carbon. And it's going to come much faster than the carbon work has come through, just because we've already got the ground paved through from the carbon work. And the carbon targets. And we're going to see exactly the same thing play out for businesses and our communities on nature. And none too soon, because it's crucial.
That's excellent. So that should really actually make us think, if I am resisting it up to now, well, we've got to do it one way or the other. So I might as well get on and get going.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, lovely to speak to you, Steve.
Yeah, no, really enjoyed that, Tom. And thank you ever so much for your time. And let's keep in touch.
Yeah, pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for another session on building a greener future. Did you enjoy this discussion? If you have any further topics you'd like us to cover, projects to discuss, or any questions, please feel free to drop me a line at steve@ans.global. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon, and have a great day.